The Duchess sat alone at the end of the long table, while everyone pretended she did not exist. Champagne flutes sparkled under candlelight. Laughter rippled in polite waves. Footmen glided between velvet-draped chairs, serving roasted pheasant with delicate precision. But at the farthest edge of the room, where the firelight barely reached, Rosalind Cavendish, now the Duchess of Blackthorn, held her silver fork over untouched porcelain and felt the cold weight of 50 stares that deliberately avoided her face. She was 20 years old. She had been married 362 days, and in all that time, her husband had never once looked at her as though she were actually present. Across the sea of elegant heads, Duke Adrian Blackthorn lifted his wine glass. His profile was carved marble, all sharp angles and winter stillness. He spoke to an earl on his right, murmured something that earned a quiet chuckle. He did not glance toward the end of the table. He never did. The lady beside Rosalind, a baroness with pearls dripping to her waist, leaned to her companion and whispered just loud enough to carry. "They say he married her out of duty, the poor thing. He hasn't visited her chambers even once." The words landed like small stones dropped into still water. Rosalind's spine turned rigid, but her expression remained soft, carefully blank. A duchess did not flinch. A duchess did not cry. She had learned that lesson during the first week of her marriage, when she had dared to greet Adrian in the gallery, and he had walked past her as if she were a ghost haunting his house. She set down her fork. No one noticed. The dinner wore on for 2 hours. Adrian never spoke her name. When the guests departed, he stood in the great hall bidding farewell with polished courtesy, his dark hair catching the torchlight. Rosalind hovered near the staircase, fingers curled around the banister, waiting for a moment that never came. He did not seek her out to say good night. He simply turned and strode toward the east wing, his boots echoing down a corridor she was not permitted to enter. She had been told on her wedding night that the east wing was his private domain. Her own rooms, generously appointed, lay on the opposite side of the manor. A gulf of marble and silence lay between them. That night she sat at her vanity while her lady's maid brushed out her chestnut hair. The mirror reflected a young woman with quiet hazel eyes, a mouth that still held a trace of girlhood softness, and cheekbones that had grown sharper over a year of swallowing sorrow. She looked older than 20. She felt ancient. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" the maid asked gently. Rosalind shook her head. The title still felt like a borrowed coat, heavy and ill-fitting. "No, thank you, Cora." Alone, she pressed her palm against the cold glass and made herself face the truth she had been dodging for months. Adrian Blackthorn did not dislike her. He simply did not care. Dislike would have required energy. Hatred would have meant she occupied some corner of his mind. But she was nothing. A signature on a contract. A name added to his household ledger. A woman he married to settle a debt her father owed and to quell whispers after his younger brother's scandalous death had shaken the family honor. She had entered Blackthorn Manor with a heart full of timid hope. She left that hope behind her each morning, like a discarded shawl, a little more threadbare every day. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in autumn, though Rosalind would not recognize its significance until much later. She had spent the morning visiting the tenants on the estate's farthest farms. It was a habit she had begun quietly, almost secretly. At first, she had only wanted to escape the manor's suffocating silence. But soon she discovered that the cottagers did not care about cold dukes or whispered gossip. They cared about roof leaks and sick children and whether the winter stores would hold. And Rosalind found that she could help. She brought baskets of bread, read letters to the blind blacksmith, sat beside a young mother recovering from childbirth while the woman wept with exhaustion. It cost nothing to be kind, and she had an endless supply of time. The servants began to smile when they saw her. The tenants began to wave. She became a quiet fixture, a duchess who walked muddy paths instead of gliding through ballrooms. That particular Tuesday, she returned to the manor with mud on the hem of her gray wool dress, and a single wildflower tucked into her hair by a grateful child. She slipped through the kitchens to avoid the main hall, only to stop short when she heard voices in the corridor. Adrian's voice, low, cool, unmistakable. "The Duchess is not to be disturbed by trivial matters. I did not bring her here to play lady of the manor. She is a duty I fulfill, nothing more." The word struck Rosalind's chest and stayed there, lodged like a blade. She pressed herself against the stone wall, one hand covering her mouth. Her heartbeat thundered so loudly she was sure they would hear it, but the footsteps faded, and she was left with the echo. "A duty I fulfill, nothing more." She had known it, of course she had known, but hearing it spoken aloud in that flat, dismissive tone shattered something delicate inside her. The last fragile seed of hope dried up and blew away. She did not cry, not then. She walked to her chambers, removed the wildflower from her hair and placed it on the windowsill. Then she looked out at the vast, beautiful parkland of Blackthorn Manor, the manicured gardens, the silver ribbon of the river, and realized she had spent a year loving a man who saw her as an obligation. She had given him patience, silence, deference, warmth. She had rearranged her entire soul to fit into the narrow space he allowed her, and it had never been enough. From that day forward, Rosalind stopped trying. She stopped waiting for Adrian in the breakfast parlor each morning. She stopped wearing the jewel-toned gown she had once hoped would catch his eye. She began taking her meals in the village or in her own chambers. When Adrian hosted dinners, she attended with polite grace, but she no longer hovered at the edge of his vision, hopping for a glance. She became a figure of quiet efficiency, a woman who smiled distantly and excused herself early. At first, no one noticed. The manor ran as it always had. But a month later, something shifted. Adrian Blackthorn walked into the breakfast parlor expecting the usual scene. Rosalind seated at the far end of the table, hands folded, eyes flicking up with that earnest, painful hope he could never stomach. Instead, the chair was empty, her plate absent. Only a single vase of fresh-cut roses marked the table. He paused mid-stride. A footman appeared. "The Duchess took breakfast in the village, Your Grace. She mentioned visiting the weavers." Adrian said nothing. He sat down and unfolded his newspaper with a snap, but his eyes rested on the empty chair a moment too long. Days passed. He noticed other small absences. The sound of her laugh, once a soft ripple in the corridors, had vanished. He no longer caught the scent of lavender trailing through the gallery at mid-morning. When he returned from riding, she was not at the window, book in hand, pretending to read while she stole glances at him. The window was empty. It unsettled him. He told himself it was relief. The girl had finally accepted her place. She was no longer clinging to his shadow. Good. But relief never came. Instead, a strange, cold restlessness settled beneath his ribs. The manor felt larger, quieter. He found himself listening for footsteps that never came. Then one evening, Lord Nathaniel Harrow arrived. Nathaniel was a neighbor, an earl of modest fortune and immoderate charm. He had a quick smile and an easy manner that put everyone at ease. When he stepped into the drawing room, his gaze went immediately to Rosalind, who sat by the window with a ledger in her lap, tallying numbers for the new village school she was quietly funding. "Duchess." Nathaniel crossed the room and bowed over her hand with warmth that bordered on reverence. "You look well. The country air suits you." Rosalind's smile was genuine, the first Adrian had seen in weeks. "Lord Harrow, I didn't know you were visiting." "I heard about your school project. I came to offer a donation." Adrian stood near the fireplace, watching the exchange with a goblet of brandy in his hand. Something hot and sharp twisted in his gut. He did not understand it. He had no claim on her affections. He had made that abundantly clear. So why did the sight of another man's attention directed at his wife make his jaw clench until his teeth ached? Nathaniel stayed for dinner. He seated himself beside Rosalind without invitation, made her laugh 3 times, and complimented the lavender trim on her gown. Adrian, seated at the head of the table, ate in grim silence. His responses to Nathaniel's polite conversation were clipped, almost rude. Rosalind did not look at him once. Not once. After the meal, Nathaniel lingered in the hall, speaking to Rosalind in low tones. Adrian stood at the threshold of the library, hidden in shadow, listening. "You deserve far more than this place gives you," Nathaniel said softly. "If you ever need a friend, my door is always open." Rosalind's answer was quiet, but Adrian caught the tremor in her voice. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Adrian's fingers tightened around the doorframe. He had never heard that tremor. He had never been the one to put it there, nor the one to soothe it. And in that moment, he understood with brutal clarity that someone else might be. Jealousy, he discovered, was not a fire. It was a slow, creeping frost that numbed everything except the ache. The next morning, he did something he had not done in over a year. He sought her out. He found Rosalind in the east garden, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, planting lavender alongside the head gardener. She looked up at his approach, and for the first time her expression did not flicker with hope. It was merely polite, guarded. "Your Grace," she said, brushing soil from her hands, "is something the matter?" He had not prepared what to say. Words had never failed him in Parliament or in business, but standing before his own wife, he felt utterly unarmed. "I wish to speak with you." She rose, waiting, no eager questions, no softening. "The Earl of Harrow," Adrian began, and immediately regretted it. "His visits are becoming frequent." Rosalind's gaze did not waver. "Lord Harrow has been kind enough to support the school, nothing more. He looks at you with more than kindness." A faint flush colored her cheeks, but it was not embarrassment. It was the slow burn of a woman who had been pushed too far. "And what concern is that of yours?" The question landed like a slap. He had no answer. She was his wife in name only. She owed him nothing. He had ensured that. "I am still your husband," he said, though the words felt hollow. Rosalind lifted her chin. "You are my husband by law, Your Grace, but you have never wanted to be my husband in any way that matters. I have stopped pretending otherwise. I suggest you do the same." She walked past him, leaving the scent of lavender and soil in her wake. Adrian stood rooted to the path, his chest tight with an emotion he could not name, though it tasted a great deal like shame. The weeks that followed marked a new kind of winter inside Blackthorn Manor. Rosalind continued her work. The school took shape, a modest stone building on the edge of the village, funded by the small allowance Adrian gave her and a secret donation from an anonymous benefactor. She spent her days there, overseeing lessons, teaching younger children their letters, returning to the manor only when the sky darkened. Adrian watched her leave each morning from the library window. He watched her return each evening, her hair wind-tossed, her cheeks pink with cold. She never looked up at his window. She never paused at the foot of the stairs as if hopping to see him. She simply walked inside, and the door closed softly behind her. He began to miss her. Not the idea of her, not the quiet, hopeful girl who had once decorated his dinner table like a forgotten ornament. He missed the woman she was becoming, strong, self-possessed, utterly indifferent to him. One rainy afternoon, his steward brought him a ledger that had been misplaced. "Your Grace, I found this in the Duchess's sitting room. I thought you should see it." Adrian opened the leather-bound book, expecting household accounts. Instead, he found pages of neat handwriting, columns of figures, and a list of names. Widow Harrow, 3 children, new roof needed. Thomas Miller, injured leg, cannot work, funds for winter. Young Bess, school fees, books, shoes. At the bottom of each entry was a notation, paid in full. The amounts were not large, but they were consistent, and they came from a source marked only as R.C. Rosalind's initials. He frowned. She had been using her personal allowance to support the tenants, but the sums exceeded what he provided her. Flipping to the back of the ledger, he found a loose slip of paper. It was a bank receipt, made out to Mrs. Clara Blackthorne. Adrian's blood went cold. Clara was his brother's widow, the brother whose disgrace and death had scarred their family, whose memory Adrian had locked away behind walls of anger and guilt. He had not spoken Clara's name in 3 years. He had not provided for her, convinced that her late husband's gambling had brought ruin upon them all, and that she had been complicit in his deceptions. But here was proof, in his wife's careful script, that Rosalind had been sending money to Clara every month since the 2nd week of their marriage, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Notes accompanied the payments, for Thomas's schooling, for winter coats, hope you are well. Adrian sank into his chair, the ledger heavy in his hands. He remembered his own bitter words spoken in the corridor that day. She is a duty I fulfill, nothing more. And while he had been nursing old wounds, Rosalind had been quietly healing the wounds he had ignored. She had found his brother's widow, abandoned and forgotten, and she had taken her under her quiet protection without ever asking for thanks, without ever telling him. The shame that flooded him was so complete it left no room for pride. He had to find her. He rode to the village through the rain, arriving soaked and breathless at the schoolhouse door. The children had gone home. Only Rosalind remained, tidying the single room, a candle flickering on the desk. She looked up when he entered, and her surprise was swiftly masked by that new, careful distance. "Your Grace, you're wet." "I needed to see you." His voice was hoarse, nothing like his usual controlled tone. "I found the ledger, the payments to Clara." Rosalind stilled. The candlelight caught the faint tremor in her hand before she clasped it firmly. "You went through my things." "I did not mean to, but I saw enough." He stepped closer, rain dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. "Why did you never tell me?" "What would you have done if I had?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "You made it very clear you did not want to hear anything from me. I decided my silence was better than your anger at an innocent woman and her child." Adrian flinched. "You think I would have been angry?" "I know you, Adrian." The use of his name, stripped of title, struck him like a thunderclap. "I spent a year learning your coldness. You blamed my family for things beyond my control. You blamed your brother's widow for standing by him. You shut out everyone who might have loved you. I did not want Clara to suffer more because of your pride." He stood motionless, water pooling at his feet. The truth of her words was a blade that cut cleanly through every defense he had built. "I was wrong," he said, the words foreign and jagged on his tongue. "About Clara, about you, about everything." Rosalind's expression did not soften. She looked at him with the weary eyes of a woman who had already mourned a marriage that never lived. "It is too late for apologies. I have nothing left to give you." The statement was calm, almost gentle, but it shattered him. "Rosalind." He reached for her hand, and for the first time she pulled away. "No," she whispered. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to ignore me for a year and then decide you want my forgiveness because you feel guilty. I'm not a conscience you can soothe with a few kind words. I made myself invisible for you. I starved myself of affection, of companionship, of the smallest warmth, because I believed that if I was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough, you might one day see me. But I am done being invisible. I have found a life that does not require your approval. Please let me keep it." She blew out the candle and walked past him into the rain. Adrian stood alone in the dark schoolroom, her words ringing in his ears, and for the first time in his adult life, he was truly afraid. Not of scandal or ruin, but of losing the one person who had loved him without condition, and whom he had discarded without a second thought. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, the damning ledger open before him, and wrote a long letter. It was addressed to Clara, his brother's widow. In it, he apologized for years of neglect and blame. He promised provision, a home on the estate if she wished, and asked forgiveness he did not deserve. He sealed it with wax and set it aside. Then he began a second letter to Rosalind. He wrote and tore up a dozen drafts. Words that had always been his allies now deserted him. How did one confess love to a woman who had stopped believing in it? How did one apologize for a year of emotional starvation? In the end, he wrote only a single line. "I see you now." He left the note on her vanity, alongside a wildflower he had picked at dawn from the same meadow where she had once found one for herself. A small, tender offering. He did not expect an answer. Days passed. Rosalind did not mention the letter, but she did not leave. She continued her work, and Adrian began slowly to join her. He did not intrude. He simply appeared. He helped carry lumber for the schoolhouse roof. He sat beside the blind blacksmith and learned to listen. He asked the tenants their names and remembered them. He walked beside Rosalind without demanding conversation, and gradually the silence between them shifted from hostility to something almost comfortable. One evening, as they walked back from the village, the sunset painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rosalind paused on the bridge over the river. Adrian stopped beside her. "Clara wrote to me," she said quietly. "She told me you offered her a cottage on the estate. She's coming next month." Adrian nodded. "It was the least I could do. Far too late, but I hope it helps." Rosalind turned to face him. The breeze lifted strands of her hair, and in the fading light she looked both fragile and unbreakable. "Why are you doing this? The charity, the tenants, the school, you never cared before." He met her gaze. His voice was raw, stripped of every defense. "Because you did. Because you saw the people I ignored and you loved them without expecting anything in return. You loved me that way once and I threw it away. I cannot undo the year I wasted. I cannot give you back the hope I extinguished. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to become a man worthy of the love you offered me, even if you never offer it again." Rosalind's eyes glistened. She blinked rapidly, turning her face toward the river. "I'm afraid, Adrian. I'm afraid that if I let you in, you'll grow cold again. I don't think I could survive that a second time." He did not reach for her. He simply stood beside her, sharing the view. "Then I will wait. Not because you ask me to, but because I want to. I will stay right here as long as it takes until you feel safe." A single tear slipped down her cheek and fell into the dark water below. She did not wipe it away. She let it fall, a quiet release of a grief that had lived inside her for so long it had become a second heartbeat. "I saw you change," she finally said. "I saw you with the children, with the tenants. I saw you write to Clara. I saw the flower on my vanity." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I never stopped loving you. That was the curse of it. Even when I wanted to hate you, I couldn't. But love without trust is just a beautiful prison. I needed to know you could be free, and that you would choose to come back to me." Adrian's composure cracked. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I chose you. I choose you now. I will choose you every morning for the rest of my life if you let me." She turned to him then, and the distance between them felt like the last thin pane of ice over a deep lake. One step, and everything would either shatter or hold. She took the step. Her hand lifted, trembling, and rested over his heart. He covered it with his own, his palm warm and solid. And for the first time in their marriage, they stood on the same ground, not as Duke and Duchess, but as two people who had walked through a long winter and finally glimpsed spring. "I loved you too late," he murmured, voice thick. "But I will spend every day proving that late love can still be enough." Rosalind did not answer with words. She simply leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, letting herself be held. The river flowed beneath them, constant and unhurried. The first stars appeared overhead, pale and tentative. That night, the east wing door stood open for the first time. It was not a grand gesture, no sweeping romance, just an open door and a quiet invitation. Adrian led her through the corridor she had never been permitted to enter, past portraits of ancestors who had also loved imperfectly, and into a private sitting room where a fire burned low and a tray of tea waited. "This was my brother's favorite room," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "I closed it after he died. I blamed everyone, including myself. I thought if I kept everyone out, I could never be hurt again. Rosalind looked around at the covered furniture and the faint layer of dust. And now? Now I see that I was already hurting, and I was hurting you in the process. He pulled a dust cloth from a small portrait on the wall, a young man with Adrian's dark eyes and a warm, reckless smile. This is William. He would have liked you. He always said I needed someone with a spine strong enough to match my stubbornness. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I think I would have liked him too. They sat together by the fire, and for the first time they talked. Not about duties or estates or appearances. They talked about childhood memories, favorite books, the way the light fell in autumn. Adrian asked about her dreams, and she told him of the school, the village, the wildflower meadow she had discovered on the western hill. He listened as if every word were a gift, and perhaps it was. The healing was not instantaneous. There were mornings when Rosalind still woke with the ghost of loneliness in her chest. There were moments when Adrian's old aloofness flickered, a reflex he had not yet unlearned. But he would catch himself, and she would watch him consciously soften, and the effort itself was a balm. One afternoon, Nathaniel Harrow returned to the estate. He brought a book for the school and a bouquet of wildflowers for Rosalind. Adrian met him at the door, and instead of coldness, he offered a handshake and a genuine, if slightly strained, "Thank you for your kindness to my wife." Nathaniel glanced between them, saw Rosalind's quiet smile, and understood. He took his leave with grace, and as his carriage rolled away, Adrian turned to Rosalind with a rueful tilt of his lips. "I was jealous of him," he admitted, "frighteningly so." "I know," she looped her arm through his. "But you have nothing to fear. I chose you a long time ago. I just needed you to choose me back." He pressed a kiss to her hair. I will always." Summer arrived, and with it, the opening of the village school. The entire parish turned out to celebrate, and at the center of the crowd stood the Duchess of Blackthorn, radiant in a simple blue dress with lavender woven into her hair. She cut the ribbon with a pair of silver scissors, and the children cheered. Adrian stood beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back, a public declaration that needed no words. The tenants whispered, not with pity now, but with warm approval. The Duke had finally learned to see his wife, and the change had transformed them both. Clara Blackthorn attended with her young son, Thomas. She and Rosalind embraced like old friends, and when Clara thanked Adrian for the cottage and the second chance, his throat tightened so much he could barely reply. But Rosalind squeezed his hand, anchoring him, and he found his voice. Later, when the festivities had wound down and the lanterns glowed softly in the dusk, Rosalind and Adrian walked to their bridge. The river ran silver beneath them, the same river that had witnessed her tears and his confession. "I have something for you," Adrian said. He drew a small velvet box from his coat pocket. Inside lay a ring, not the heavy ducal band she had worn for duty, but a delicate circlet of intertwined gold and lavender enamel, set with a single pearl. "It's a promise," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Not a replacement for the past, but a hope for the future. That I will listen, that I will see you, that I will never take your presence for granted again. I love you, Rosalind. Not too late, I hope, but just in time." She looked at the ring, then at the man who had once been a stranger in her own home. The ice had thawed completely. His dark eyes held a warmth she had only dreamed of, and his hand, when it lifted to cradle her cheek, was gentle in a way that spoke of long-practiced care. "Just in time," she echoed, her voice catching on a joyful sob. She let him slide the ring onto her finger, where it rested above the original band like a new chapter laid atop an old one. He kissed her then, softly, with the reverence of a man who had almost lost a treasure he had been too blind to value. And when they finally drew apart, the stars had fully emerged, and the manor windows glowed golden on the hill. Hand in hand they walked home. Not to separate wings, not to cold silences, but to a shared life built from the ashes of pain, watered by regret, and blooming at long last into love. The Duchess of Blackthorn was no longer invisible. She never would be again. And the Duke, who had once been ice, had learned to burn.